Hey everybody, welcome to week 2. This week we will be reading chapter 1, which is on pages 2 to 19 in the book. If you haven't gotten the book, you can get it through the bookstore, both in a print edition as well as a online edition through Cengage. You can also get it online. Let's see, assignments due this week. You have quiz number 2, and I'll talk you through a couple of those main points in a second. You have discussion post number 2, which is talking about people first language or human centered language. So that's all about just being really nuanced in the language that we're using to be more inclusive. So there's 2 videos for you to watch in the discussion, and then 3 questions. Respond to each one of those 3. And then very important, your observation plan is due this week. Since you have to do 30 hours of observation, it's very important that you plan ahead. So this week you will submit the observation plan, and it's very simple. It's just let me know where you're going to do your observation, and then who you're going to do your observation of, and then when you're going to complete it. So just let me know that you have a plan for each one. Remember, you're doing 10 hours of infant observations, 10 hours of a toddler observation, and 10 hours of a 3 or 4-year-old observation. So, so this week we're talking about the history and the legislation of special education in the United States. So we talked with Toria Argus last week in the guest lecture, and she talked about Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which was a landmark Supreme Court case in 1954, and that civil rights case, once it was ruled, it declared that separate education was not equal, whether that was based on race or disability. So before Brown versus the Board of Education, school administrators refused to allow some children with disabilities to attend public schools. And then once the Supreme Court ruled for Brown versus the Board of Education, they said that schools could no longer be separate, but they had to be integrated for race, but also that children with disabilities or special needs should be included in those public schools. And then this week, you're also going to read about how all children are entitled to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So going to school, or potentially even in some of the schools that you work in now, you may be familiar with the concept of pull-out groups or pull-out classrooms or separate classrooms for kids. And while that is appropriate, sometimes, for example, a child who is behind in reading, or a child who may need certain occupational or physical therapy, it may be best for them to be pulled out of the classroom to get specialized services. But the aim of education is to provide the least restrictive environment, meaning that we want to include as much as we can in a classroom for all children. And then this week, you are also going to read about the zone of proximal development, or ZPD, and that is a theory coined by Lev Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist. And what the ZPD is basically it is this particular area in which of challenge. So it's a range of tasks that children could not necessarily accomplish alone, but that they can do with the help of competent adults or peers. So, for example, think of learning to tie your shoes. Once a child has the fine motor skills and the dexterity to actually tie their shoes, it's going to take them forever to figure out how to tie their shoes on their own. But with the guidance of an adult, giving them step by step. First, you hold the laces, then you cross the laces, then you make a loop. Walking through those steps, the child's able to do it. And obviously, it's going to take repeated times, but it's that really appropriate area of challenge. So whenever we're working with kids, it's really important to see what that zone of proximal development is for them so that we can challenge them in ways that are appropriate. Another theorist you're going to read about, well, not theorist, but a psychologist, is Alfred Bandura. So Alfred Bandura was a behaviorist, did a lot of work in the 90s, and his work, or part of his work, focused on how children learn by modeling other children. So segregating children at an early age meant that children with disabilities had only peers with disabilities available as models, as well as their teachers. But with teacher support and exposure, children with disabilities can learn to model and play with typically developing peers. In fact, all children can gain experience in interacting with a wide range of people. So when we talk about inclusive classrooms, we want to include children with special needs or disabilities so that they can learn from their peers, but also think about typically or normally developing children and what they can learn from children with disabilities. You know, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all model of doing things, that, you know, whenever we have potentially a physical limitation or an intellectual or cognitive limitation, that we can still accomplish things just in different ways. So that's one of the main contributions of Bandura, as well as thinking about the inclusive classroom. This week, we also read a little bit about developmentally appropriate practice and the different aspects. I think one of the important ones is individual appropriateness, which requires that the environment, materials, and interactions with adults be consistent with the ability and needs of each child, by focusing on providing options for children rather than expecting all children to do the same thing at the same time. So this is also known as differentiation or differentiated instruction, making sure that each child has what they need to succeed. But in terms of developmentally appropriate practice, this is called individual appropriateness. Again, inclusion is a big word that we're going to talk a lot about in this course. We'll read a little bit about it in chapter 1. And designing services around children rather than fitting children into existing services is the goal of inclusion. So having children in classrooms and making sure that they have the supports in the least restrictive environment possible is the goal of inclusion. And then we read a little bit about barriers to inclusion. So things like lack of awareness, lack of professional preparation, adult-child ratios in class size, lack of communication, collaboration, and respect, lack of supports. These are all barriers to inclusion, things that we need to find ways around. And a lot of ways we do that is through policy, whether at the federal or state level, and even the school level. So those are kind of some things that we've overcome, and include also some things that we need to, as a society and as a nation, work a little harder to overcome. All right, we also this week read a little bit about service delivery models. So those could be home-based service delivery systems or models, center-based, public school, hospital-based, basically any way that we are offering services or supports to children. And one important one, depending on the severity of certain physical limitations or disabilities, is the home-based service delivery system. These usually use a consultation model that involves an early interventionist. So this might be a nurse, a child development specialist, an early childhood educator who visits the family in their home on a regularly scheduled basis. So you'll see a lot of this, particularly in the first couple of years of a child's life before they enter a formal education program. They might need occupational therapy in their first few years of life, some physical therapy, some cognitive therapy, anything like that. So the home-based service delivery system, unless you are a social worker or an early intervention specialist, you probably are not going to be interacting with this a lot, but you may have children who have worked with or within that model coming into some of your classrooms. And then finally, we'll read a little bit about early Head Start and Head Start. So Head Start, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, is a program specifically for 3 and 4-year-olds. And Head Start began in the summer of 1965 with the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, actually, as or was championed by his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, as First Lady. But Head Start is a comprehensive service system that's designed to deliver health, education, and social services to children and families who meet low-income eligibility criteria. And for those of you who are familiar with Head Start programs, it has a strong commitment to family involvement and inclusion, and families have to complete a certain number of hourly requirements or contributions to either the school program or in the community. So that is an overview of chapter 1 and some of the things key takeaways, some things you'll see at the quiz. Don't forget to do the discussion post, which includes reading or watching the videos on People First Language, and then to complete your observation plan. Very important that you plan ahead to make sure that you are successful in your observation. So hope you have a good week, and I'll see you soon.